Stay back!
The exit's underwater. You're done.
Alright, so now we're going to be covering Salvatore Moreau, the fish of Resident Evil Village. Probably most people would say this is the weakest part of the game. It's very straightforward. Again, with Moreau, there's not a lot of backstory, but there's a few interesting details. I personally kind of enjoy the boss fight of this area. I think it's a good boss fight. It feels very old school in terms of the boss fight itself. But the whole gauntlet, the running the gauntlet thing, does get very tedious after multiple runs. Like, you already know what to do, and it is very straightforward. But overall, like I said, the boss fight is pretty good. So today we're going over his backstory, a few extra details and stuff like that, as well as, you know, a couple of things you may not know. So without any further ado, let's jump into the Fishman himself. Okay, so like I said, there's not a lot to go off of, but from what we do know, he is the final serving lord of House Moreau. If you aren't aware, Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Beneviento and Moreau all have separate houses that kind of lead the village. Whether it's like, they'll kind of do different things to kind of work together to kind of enforce the village before everything went crazy. And Moreau was the last living member of that house. Obviously there's Dimitrescu, which has the daughters, which aren't technically Dimitrescu's, because they are basically adopted. Heisenberg is the last of his, and Donna is the last of hers. So they're all very much the lone survivors of their independent houses. A few little backstory information, ideas you can kind of get behind with the character himself is in certain cutscenes you can see a tattoo on one of his arms before he turns into like the giant fish. And the tattoo reads Mother on it with like a symbol of an anchor. This could suggest that he was some kind of, you know, fisherman or something like that. Where he kind of lives, obviously, it was before it went to hell. Again, his part of the village was very much a kind of a fisherman area where people would go and obviously fish. So maybe he did kind of enjoy doing that, or something he may have done, you know, as a hobby or something like that beforehand. But yeah, back to the houses. Obviously, they each controlled an individual territory, and the Moreaus did control the mountain village, which you are in during his section of the game. Obviously, it's a lot more run down, and most of it's underwater at this point. But that is the section of land they owned across the village. And, you know, visually, I would say it looks really nice. Obviously, it's a bit more destroyed now than what it was. But it is still a pretty nice area to be in. I think, in terms of Moreau's kind of territory in general, I think it's really well designed. And it really does give off that whole old school kind of, well, village vibe. So moving forward slightly, when he did encounter Miranda, obviously he is one of her experiments. Again, to briefly go over that, Miranda wanted to kind of find the ideal host for the Cadeau parasite to bring back her daughter. Obviously the Four Lords did kind of connect with it on a certain level, but Moreau was unfortunately the least compatible with it. It did change his form completely. He lost a lot of his own kind of personal self. He kind of got really dumb. Because he used to be quite smart beforehand, and we'll get to that a little later on, and it did kind of mainly take over his entire body, whereas with the others, yes, they had control over their powers to an extent, but there was defects with them. Obviously with Donna, she's completely underdeveloped mentally. With Dimitrescu, she needs an intake of blood, or she kind of can't control her powers, and then Heisenberg we'll get to later on. But yeah, Moreau is the least compatible with the parasite, unfortunately for him. So after Moreau's basically complete transformation into what we see him as now, he did isolate himself back in his village. He would try and always impress Miranda as best he could. It was kind of like a way to kind of prove himself to himself, basically, to show that he's not useless, even though the parasite has completely taken over his body at this point. He would experiment on villagers in his own way to try and find someone for Miranda who she could use, but to no success, unfortunately. And in the end, he did kind of prey on people that would come into the village he owned and fish there. He would obviously turn into his salamander form, his massive fish form, and kill them just because he needed to, really. One final note to add to Moreau himself in terms of backstory. There is a sign in his area that says Moreau's Clinic. This might not have been him but it would suggest that maybe he was some kind of doctor back in the day. They did change that, however, from Donna, so he could have been the doctor. So let's dive a little bit more into his powers and kind of go over those now. Obviously, the main thing being he turns into a huge fish. On top of that, you see a lot more of it throughout the boss fight, but he can kind of create a large amount of like acid vomit. And you know, acid is pretty dangerous. Obviously, it's a pretty devastating attack in the game if you are stuck in it. I believe it can basically one-shot you from normal upwards. But I haven't played normal in this game for a while, but it's acid. It's dangerous. Don't be in it. Again, it does seem to suggest you could control his transformation at will, but by the time you kind of meet him as Ethan, it seems to not be possible anymore. Maybe just the fact that the Kado is kind of more dominant in his body than his actual self, that you can't control it anymore, and you just kind of get stuck looking like a fish man for the whole rest of the whole section of the game. Now, in terms of the actual kind of theme around Moreau and his kind of territory in the game and how it kind of mixes well with others, the 4 individual lords all kind of follow a different tone of horror. They all are horror, obviously some more than others, but they all have a different theme around them, which is a lot of people kind of picked up on after playing the game enough. With Dimitrescu, it's more gothic horror. Obviously the castle itself is very gothic looking, and obviously vampires, quote, vampires, are there, so it's all very old school, very generic kind of gothic traits and stuff like that. Donna is completely psychological horror. It works not only well with the things you see in the house, but her character as well, with her kind of mental instability and stuff like that. So that is very much on the side of psychological. Moreau, I would say, is more body horror. For example, you know, things like like old school films, like I'm trying to think, like The Thing and stuff like that. Assimilation, all that kind of stuff. Basically, just disgusting forms of things, basically, in simple terms. And Heisenberg is probably a blend of a lot of them. Heisenberg's kind of horror theme is, again, probably body horror with what he's doing with corpses he's digging up. Obviously, he's turning them into these kind of super soldiers. But then it's more gothic as well, again, because of it. Well, it's not really gothic, it's more like steamy, punky type. But that is a blend of probably body horror and gothic. What Heisenberg kind of reminds me of, and a lot of people of, is Frankenstein's monster. Stuff like that, like he's creating these abominations rather than turning into them. But yeah, back to Moreau, it's more body horror, you know, stuff like, again, The Thing, Assimilation, stuff like that. It's very much a case of the human body turning into something rather than the human body being created into something else by someone else. A couple of little extra kind of facts about the kind of design and the ideas behind the character himself is his design, his overall physical design, not the fish form, his kind of normal, quote, normal form, was in fact inspired by Japanese river creatures going by the name Kappa. These are pretty dangerous creatures in Japanese folklore that would essentially drag people into the rivers or the ponds and kill them, and his design is kind of influenced by those. And then also, apparently, and I have seen this in the concept art, you can go check this out yourself, Moreau was in early stages kind of first introduced watching romantic movies and eating a bowl of cheese. They changed that completely, but that would have been pretty funny to see. You kind of do feel sorry for the character at times, but that would just been kind of funny to see, and how Ethan would have reacted to that. And then finally, the little extra bit of bonus info is his crown he wears when it's in his normal form is made out of villager bones. Of the bones he has eaten. Well, the people he has eaten. The bones of the people he has eaten. That made his crown. So that's pretty grim. But yeah, that is basically the whole backstory and information you need to know about Moreau that the game doesn't necessarily tell you. Do let me know what you think of the character. I know a lot of people do kind of put him and his whole area of the game as the lowest part of the game. Again, like I've said earlier in the video, I do like the boss fight with him. It's pretty good. The gauntlet's pretty fun for the first couple times, but then it gets kind of tedious. It would have been better if they did change the order of things on how you get through the bridges and such. Each run, obviously there's only a certain few combinations you could do, but to kind of have them randomised would have been a pretty interesting kind of way to keep it more engaging. But yeah, I would probably put him as my 4th as well, out of all the 4 lords, mainly because it's a pretty straightforward area, and then the boss fight does make up for that. But It's not particularly long, it's not particularly engaging, but the boss fight itself does give it some enjoyment. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of its backstory, its character in general. I'm always interested to know what you guys think of certain things. But yeah, thank you all for coming by, and as always, I'll catch you all tomorrow for a brand new video where we'll be going over Heisenberg.